We are now going to install the throttle and choke cable, which will attach directly to your Carter carburetor onto these two clamps right here. The top clamp is where your choke cable will go. The sleeve will run through your top clamp, and the wire will go to this wire stop, which will open and close your choke flap. While the bottom clamp is where the sleeve of your throttle cable will go, the wire will run all the way down and go through this hole right here. A wire stop will be placed on the other end, and this will open and close the accelerator flap in your carburetor. Going over all different parts of this installation, we have the throttle cable, the choke cable, we have a wire stop. The wire stop will only be used with the throttle cable, as this will actually be used down where our accelerator flap is. And we're also going to need a pair of snips. This will allow us to cut the sleeve on our cables and the wire to get the proper length for the Carter carburetor to work with the choke flap and the accelerator flap. We're also going to need a flathead screwdriver to tighten down any of the bolts. Here we have a diagram of the location of holes in Firewall. We want to make sure we install the choke and throttle cable in the right holes on the Firewall. So looking at this picture, we can tell that the choke and the throttle cable will go through this hole, or in other words, it'll go through this hole where my finger points on the Firewall. Now we're in the interior of the Jeep, and we have to make sure we get the dashboard diagram correct with the hole locations. As you can see, the throttle cable is to the left and the choke is to the right, so we have to make sure we get this installed right on the dashboard. The left is the throttle and the right is the choke. Now it is time to install the choke and throttle cable through the dashboard on the Jeep, and to do so you have to take off the nut and the washer on the back side of each of the cables. Just pull them completely off. The choke cable will be installed first. Please note the choke cable is installed on the right side of the dashboard, and to install it, we'll just get our wire and push it through the dashboard, aligning it with that hole on the right side, just pushing it all the way through until it hits the firewall. And now we'll have to go behind the dashboard underneath to put on our washer and our nut so we can thread and tighten our choke cable to the dashboard. It's going to be hard to show you how the washer and nut fits onto your wire because it's so tight underneath in the dashboard, but this is how it's done. I brought the cable around under the dashboard. First, I'm going to put on our washer and then our nut, and then this will allow us to thread onto the back side of the cable where these threads are on the back side of the dashboard. I'll take you underneath the dashboard to show you what is happening in a better view. As you go under the dashboard, we can see the choke cable right here. There is the washer and nut on the back side of the cable, and the cable will go through this hole where my finger points, through the rubber garment and through the firewall. Now I'm going to take you from the interior of the Jeep, of the dashboard, to where the engine is and where the cable will come out of the firewall. The carburetor is located right here, and the cable will come out of this hole right back here. We'll pull the cable all the way through and all the way out. And now we'll go back on the interior of the Jeep where the dashboard is to secure the cable. On the back side of the choke cable, install the washer and nut. Just tighten it up with a 9/16 inch wrench till it's snug. You want to make sure that your choke cable is flush with your dashboard and it's pushed all the way in. Repeat the exact same steps with the throttle cable as we just did with the choke cable. The throttle cable will be installed into this hole. You're going to feed the cable through the dashboard, then install the washer and nut and feed these through the cable. Then you're going to push it through the same hole as we did with the choke cable on the firewall, and then we're going to tighten our nut to the threads on the throttle cable. Now install the throttle cable through the dashboard, just pushing it through that hole I showed you. Just going to push it through. The throttle cable has been pushed through the firewall, coming through the same hole the choke cable came through. Going over the dashboard once again, the choke cable's on the right side, the throttle cable's on the left side. Now tighten the nut on the back side of the throttle cable when it's pushed all the way through the dashboard and the firewall. Make sure the cable is firmly pressed against the dashboard, and you have to make sure the labels are straight and they are readable. Use your 9/16" wrench to tighten the nuts on the backside once everything is set properly. The next step is to install the choke cable first. The choke cable will be installed onto the top bracket where my finger is pointing. We'll have to just use a Sharpie just to mark the length of our cable. As you can see, it's way longer than it needs to be. And we'll just mark it so it's about a 1/4 inch longer than the bracket. We use a Sharpie just to make a line. And now we'll have to cut our cable to this length that was just marked. This mark is only on the sleeve of the choke cable. The sleeve of the choke cable will have to be cut first before the inner part of the cable can be cut. This will allow us to get the proper length on the choke cable flap on the carburetor, and we'll have to cut this using a pair of snips. With wire cutters, now we can spread open the sleeve on the choke cable where a mark is, just pressing on it, and that will spread open the choke cable sleeve. Pull back this portion of the choke cable all the way back to the mark we made on the sleeve of the choke cable. Now in the interior of the Jeep, pull the choke cable all the way out. Cut the sleeve under choke cable where we just opened it previously. Use your wire cutters to cut. The sleeve on the choke cable has now been cut, and now we can feed this end through the top clamp on the carburetor. We'll just kind of pull it back and we'll just slide it right through the clamp. Now back in the interior of the Jeep, we can push our cable back into the sleeve of the choke cable, just feeding it all the way back in. Now back in the interior of the Jeep, the inner portion of the choke cable has been pushed through the choke cable sleeve, and now we can cut the inner portion to the right size for the choke valve on the carburetor, which will operate like this when the cable is pulled. Before we cut the choke cable, make sure the choke cable is pushed all the way back against the dashboard and your label is straight and readable. Now with the choke cable all set in the interior of the Jeep, now we have to cut the inner portion of the choke cable. We're going to line it up with the wire stop that controls the choke plate in the carburetor. We're going to mark about 1 inch from the wire stop, so mark it right there. And now we'll use our wire cutters to cut this portion of the choke cable. Now use your wire cutters to cut the inner portion of the choke cable. Now with the choke cable cut, we'll have to go in the interior of the Jeep and pull back the choke cable a little bit so we can feed it through the wire stop. Now in the interior of the Jeep, pull back the choke cable about 1 inch. Before the choke cable can be installed, unloosen the wire stop. Now pull back the entire cable slightly just so we can get the wire through the wire stop, and we'll just push it through as so. Now back on the dashboard side, push the choke cable all the way in until it's against the dashboard. Back on the engine side, we have to now set the choke cable, and to do so, as you can see right now, the choke plate is not fully open. We have to pull on this lever. This will fully open the choke plate, and we will make sure that small pin is against the carburetor. And now to set it, we have to now tighten this bolt on the wire stop, and that will set the choke cable properly. Use a flathead screwdriver to tighten down the bolt on the wire stop. We will have to make sure we pull back on the choke lever, and then we'll just tighten it until it's snug, and then we'll go a 1/4 turn past tight just so it's secure. The throttle cable now has to be installed onto the carburetor, and it'll be installed onto this lower bracket where my finger points. Make sure the lower bracket is installed correctly. You want to make sure it's installed at an angle, or this flat part is flat with the top bracket. This has to be at an angle before we mark the throttle cable, just so we get the right length, and the angle will allow us to get the right angle going down to the accelerator lever, and we'll be able to pull on this correctly. With the bracket at the right angle and the throttle cable right underneath it, we can now mark a 1/4 inch past the bracket. We'll have to cut the sleeve on the throttle cable. Now it's time to cut the sleeve. Get your wire cutters, and this will open up the sleeve so we can cut the inner wire and cut the sleeve. Now it's time to go back in the interior of the Jeep so we can pull back the throttle cable, and now we can cut the sleeve to the proper length. Pull back the throttle cable all the way. Go back to the interior of the Jeep and make sure the inner portion is now not in the way for cutting the sleeve. With the inner portion of the cable not in the way, use your wire cutters to cut the sleeve. With the sleeve now cut, put the sleeve into the lower bracket, just pulling it back and just pushing it in, and it should just slide right in, just like that. Now back on the dashboard side, we have to push the throttle cable through the dashboard. Just push the cable into the dashboard a bit. Now on the engine side, we have to pull our throttle wire underneath this bracket on the carburetor where my finger points right here. So to do so, we're going to pull on this wire, directing it down. So it goes underneath that bracket. As you can see, it's going under. The wire is coming out on the bottom side. Now back on the dashboard side, the throttle cable might get stuck right here. So we'll have to get the throttle cable back in line with that hole, just centering it. We'll have to make sure our word is readable. So we'll have to spin it around a bit, just pushing it into that hole a little bit. Now back on the engine side, the throttle cable has been pushed further down. We'll have to get this cable through that small hole down here where my finger points. So we'll get our cable and we'll just push it into that little hole, kind of bang the wire up until it slips into that hole. So now I have to go back on the dashboard side to push the throttle cable down further. Back on the dashboard side, we'll have to push our throttle cable all the way into the dashboard, pushing it all the way down and in. Now cut the inner portion of the cable about 1 inch from the accelerator lever end. I made a mark where I'm going to cut it. Now use your wire cutters and cut the wire. Our throttle cable is now pushed all the way down. There's about 1 inch coming out of the other side. The next step is to tighten this bracket on the Carter carburetor. This bracket will make sure that the throttle cable is in the right alignment to pull on this throttle flap properly down here. So to do so, we'll have to make sure that this flat section creates a 90-degree angle with this bracket on the Carter carburetor. We'll line it like that as so, and we'll have to tighten this bolt to position this properly. Now tighten down this bolt so we get this flat section 9 degrees with the Carter carburetor bracket. We'll just tighten it as so, getting it snug. Ensure that this nut is tight. Use a 3/8 inch wrench to tighten and make sure it's very snug. With this bracket now secured, the throttle cable is now orientated in the proper direction going down to our throttle flap down here. Make sure the throttle flap is pushed all the way down and the wire stop can now be secured at the end of the wire to hold the wire in place. The final step is to install the wire stop onto our throttle cable down here, and to do so we'll have to loosen this bolt about 3/4 of the way to allow that wire to slip through this small hole where my finger points. Once this bolt's unloosened, we'll now have to get this cable in line with this hole down here, just slipping it on as so. With the throttle cable now pushed to the wire stop, we're going to push it all the way up and ensure there's about a 1/16 inch gap between our wire stop and our throttle opener, as we don't want to have any tension on this wire, which will accidentally pull up our throttle flap and give acceleration to the Jeep. So leaving a small gap, we will now tighten this bolt as so. With your flathead screwdriver, now tighten this bolt on our wire stop. We'll have to tighten it till it's snug and then go about 1/8 turn past snug to ensure it's nice and tight. I'm now going to check if the choke and throttle cable operate properly by pulling on the cables. Pulling the choke cable works and the choke flap is now closed. That's operational. Now pulling the throttle cable. The throttle cable is now working because the throttle flap is now open on your carburetor. That's how you install your choke and your throttle cable onto your Carter WO carburetor. Thanks for watching and subscribe.